Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we've got a little mini monitor that's been sent to us from a customer. This is another Polk model. It's the Polk R200 and it's a fairly well made little speaker. It's not without issues, but overall it's got some good qualities. Let's take a look at this thing. First of all, nice looking box that they send out in this thing. It's got a textured finish. I'm sure it's very inexpensive to spray it in this finish over MDF, but it looks nice. Grill's well made. I like the way it goes on. It looks clean. It's magnetically held on. It's easy to remove. There are some issues with the grill as far as the way the thing measures, but overall looks okay. The port on this thing, I don't know what they're thinking on this thing. Big wacky centerpiece poking out of this port like that's supposed to do something. They should have spent the money on a little better crossover parts. That would have done a little more than what that port did. One brace running through the box, that's it. Woofer is, well, it's a stamped steel frame. I'm not a big fan of the stamped steel frame, and it's a very heavy cone. So it's not without issues, but it is some type of a, whatever they're calling this, paper composite, something or another, that has a pretty decent amount of internal damping. It's not that bad, but it's not a great response. There's a lot of parts on this thing correcting the response of this driver. In my views, it would be money's better spent in development of the driver and creating a smooth roll-off rather than having to put a whole bunch of crossover parts on there to correct a roll-off that is, or to correct a response that is not smooth. Tweeter wise, little ring radiator tweeter, it measured pretty well. Both of these fit on and have little beauty rings that fit over the ends of them to finish out the look. This one is held on magnetically. I like the way it goes on. Works really well. It's a little difficult to remove, but once you kind of get it off, it works okay. Binding post wise, they look nice. It's a good look. However, the whole back of it is just steel. The terminals that this thing connects to are steel. The screws, the nut on the end of it here is all steel. Not what you want in your signal path. I mean, in general, if you take a magnet to a crossover and it's sticking, I'll tell you, everything on there, that's not a good sign. Like, all these sandcast resistors have steel end plates on them. The electrolytic capacitors that are on this thing, they all have steel ends on them. Of course, there's iron core inductors on the woofer circuit. At least in the tweeter circuit, there was a little air core inductor. One polypropylene cap, one polyester cap. Come on, man. In the woofer circuit, all the caps are electrolytic. So, I mean, that's going to smear and suck that image right out of it. Just muffle everything along with the tiny gauge iron core inductors. So, definitely built to a price point. But how did it measure? Fair. Pretty fair. Good and bad. Let's take a look at everything. Frequency response wise, in general, looks smooth. I mean, first thought was, wow, measures really smooth. There's a little peak there at about 1100 hertz. Is it an amplitude peak, or is there stored energy there at that peak? Let's look at the spectral decay. The spectral decay is the tell-all of all measurements. It gives you the frequency response, but it also gives you the decay over time. And as you can see, that little peak there does have some stored energy there. And the reason I point that out is those are audible issues. That is a distortion there, that it's holding that residual ring, that residual energy, and it's taking longer for it to dissipate that. And as you bring power levels up louder and louder, it gets more and more extreme. Think of it as right at the top of the female vocal, just a little bit of on top of everything else. Piano notes tend to not release, but tend to carry on and ring longer than they're supposed to, not because there's a longer decay in the recording, but because this is adding additional decay on top of everything else. So there's that going on. Looking at the grill effect, you can see the grill is having some effect on it. The crossover point was rather high, And you can see by the vertical off axis, there's a dip that starts as you start moving up. That's when you're physically getting the woofer further away in time than the tweeter, and that offset in the time arrival makes them out of phase, creates a hole. So they're more in phase if you're at tweeter level and below, but if you get above it, the sound is going to change, and the overall in room response may be a little uneven because of it. Horizontal off axis looks fine, looks normal drop off that you'd see in most drivers, and the impedance shows that it is a 4 ohm load. Now, what was troubling to me when I first started this little upgrade on this is, well, I looked at that stored energy there in the woofer's response at about 1100 hertz and thought, I got to fix that. That's an audible issue. Other than that, it looks great. You could have just stuck with the original crossover if it wasn't for that issue. And I thought there's another thing there. I could push that crossover point a little lower and get the drivers in phase a little better over a wider range and improve the overall in-room response of the speaker. So I thought, all right, let's design something new for it that addresses some of those issues. So let's look at the individual driver responses. Tweeter response isn't that bad. It's a little lumpy, but it's manageable, and it does play down really low. So that told me something very important, that I could easily push that crossover point down a little lower. No issue with the tweeter reaching down into a lower range. The woofer's response, however, it's rough. Where the baffle step loss is, it's compounded by a ramped up response. There is a notch filter that was in the original crossover on this thing on here that is removing a peak that is about 700 hertz. In other words, it's taking that step loss, and instead of just putting a coil on it and pulling it down, which would create a dipped area, they're pulling down the peak with a notch filter, which is not a bad idea. However, they ignored the peak right after it. So there was a lot to have to consider when doing this crossover, and it's not going to be just a couple of parts. I wound up leaving the notch filter at 700 hertz that they had and putting a little bigger inductor on it and adding another little notch filter right there at 1100 hertz to fix that ringing going on right there, and putting a little more of aggressive cap on the end of it to try and round that response off nice and smooth and pull it back a little bit. And let's look at the response I got out of this thing on the overall crossover. Note the way the woofer's rolling off and how smooth that is, and the tweeter's curve, how smoothly it rolled into it. Tweeter's curve had a little whoop-de-doo there at the bottom of its range, and at one point I put a filter on there that flattened it out, but it also has a peak in the off axis right there at 3K where that dip is. So one's kind of counteracting the other a little bit. So I took the more aggressive filter out of it, went ahead and let it look like you see here on the chart, and in the off axis it looked great. In fact, at about 10 to 15 degrees off axis, the thing's a flat line. So that turned out really well. And let's look at these as a comparison. Let's do that. That's always a little bit more fun. Let's look at the frequency response of the original versus the frequency response after the upgrade. Notice, again, that little bump at 1100 hertz is gone. Let's look also at the spectral decay. Let's look at the before and the after spectral decay. You notice the after is free of that stored energy, so the overall response of the whole thing is much cleaner, no more ringing in that area. Also, let's look at the vertical off axis. Let's look at a before and an after of the vertical off axis. Notice now the drivers are more in phase over a wide range. So it's going to give you a more balanced in-room response in all directions. And if you stand up and sit down, you're not going to hear a big tonality change. It's going to be consistent. Horizontal off axis is very much like it was. We can look at the before and the after in the horizontal off axis. Not a lot of change there. A lot of it just has to do with the off axis response of the drivers. And then let's look at the impedance. I'm not thrilled with the impedance with the new crossover. Let's look at the before and the after. It was a 4 ohm load. I made it drop down to a 3 ohm load because we're getting a little more aggressive with this woofer. We've added a second notch filter, and I put a bigger cap on there to pull that thing back a little bit and not let it play way up to 3,000 or 4,000 hertz. So balance things out a little bit. And sometimes when you have to use corrective filters to balance things out, sometimes it causes that impedance to drop a little bit more. And that's what happened in this case. We're dropping down to a minimum of 3 ohms in that one area versus where it was at 4 ohms. Not a big shift there. It's still normal impedance minimals for a 4 ohm speaker, and at least that dipped area is higher up in frequency, not down low where it's going to demand a bunch of current. So what we did with an upgrade on this thing is we've got much higher quality parts going into this little upgrade kit. All air core inductors, much bigger gauge inductors on there, good quality resistors, no ferrous materials in the signal path, all JB poly caps. There's a bypass JB cap on the tweeter circuit, which is a inexpensive way of kind of taking that up to another level. A set of tube connectors to replace these cheesy binding posts that are on here. In fact, you should be able to remove these and then just drill those holes out to a bigger hole to a 7/16 inch diameter, and the tube connectors will fit right in. You can glue them into this plastic cup, and if you want, you can hot glue a little on the back side to make sure that they're secure in there, but easy to mount tube connectors right into this. The wiring is going to go from this PVC jacketed stuff with these push-on connectors to high purity copper in polyethylene with no connectors in the signal path. You're going to point-to-point wire this stuff. Should all fit right in the bottom of the box, no problem. And that should improve signal transfer across the board. Also, if you add a little more insulation to this thing, you'll do away with some of that resonance that was in the port. If you look at the original impedance response, in fact, let's pull that up one more time and take a look at it. You'll see a couple of little ripples in the impedance, one down around 25 hertz and one right at the tuning frequency of the port. Found that was some internal standing reflections within the box that was coming back through that port. So adding just a little bit of fiberglass insulation in there to keep those standing waves from bouncing around in the box, that knocked it down, and then that stuff was gone. You can see the new impedance curve. You can see that that wasn't there anymore. Another thing you might want to consider, I didn't throw it in as an upgrade because I didn't feel like it was critical, because this box is fairly well built. But if you wanted to order sheet of no-res and line these things with no-res, it will definitely tighten things up a little bit and improve the bass response on it. But I didn't feel it was an absolute fix that had to be done on this one because it's a small box and it does have one brace running through it. So I'm trying to keep it at a budget level, and if you want to upgrade it, you can. That's why I'm throwing in the Sonic cap on the tweeter circuit as an additional upgrade. If you want to bump that up a little bit more, it is an additional, let's see, it was an additional $89 if you wanted to add Sonic caps to the tweeter circuit. So great little upgrade. It's definitely worth doing if you own this thing already. Get your feet wet doing a little DIY work and upgrade this thing and take it from here to here in performance. Think it's going to open up the sound of this thing. Your imaging, layering, everything is going to be much more open and much more controlled, better resolution, better. It's night and day difference when you go from this stuff to high quality parts. And when you get stuff like this out of the signal path, especially when there's a lot of it, it really adds up. So great little upgrade. That's it for this little episode here. I appreciate you guys watching. I know you love watching upgrade videos. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't. That way you get notification when we shoot new videos. And thanks for watching. See you guys in the next one.